Welcome to Pastscapes, your place for calming journeys into the past. There is a face you have seen 1,000 times, on the walls of ancient temples, on the breastplates of warriors, on coins pressed from silver in cities that no longer exist. A face with serpents for hair and eyes that turned men to stone. You know that face. You have always been told what it means. But what if the story was never really about a monster? What if, beneath the myth, beneath the marble and the heroic poetry, there was something else entirely? A woman, a temple, a crime that the gods themselves refused to name out loud, and a punishment so unjust that the ancient world buried it inside a story about a monster, so that no one would ever have to say what really happened. Tonight, we are going to say it. So settle in, let the modern world fade away, and join me as we explore the true story of Medusa. Not the creature, not the villain, but the woman who was wronged, transformed, exiled, hunted, and then, even in death, used by the very world that destroyed her. Let your body rest, let your breath slow, and let the past speak. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a coastline. Not the coastline you know, not a place with cafes and tourist maps and the smell of sunscreen drifting on a summer breeze. Imagine something older, something that existed before the word ancient even had meaning. A coastline carved by wind over 10,000 years, white cliffs above a dark sea, grasses that bend sideways in the salt air and never quite grow straight. A place where the sky feels lower somehow, closer to the earth, as if the heavens are leaning down to listen. This is the world Medusa was born into. Not a cave, not a darkness at the edge of things. She was not born snarling and terrible with serpents already writhing where her hair should be. That is the version of the story that came later, assembled carefully by poets who needed her to already be a monster before Perseus ever found her. It is a much more convenient story that way. Monsters deserve what happens to them. But women, wronged and transformed and hunted, that is a harder story to tell in verse and a much harder story to justify. So let us begin at the beginning. In the oldest layers of the Greek mythological tradition, the one that existed before Homer shaped it, before the great Athenian playwrights polished it for the stage, before Roman poets like Ovid reframed it in their own image, Medusa is described as something remarkable. She is mortal, while her two sisters, Stheno and Euryale, are immortal gorgons by birth. This detail matters more than it might first appear. It means that Medusa, alone among her sisters, can be killed. It means she was always the vulnerable one, the one exposed to time and consequence and death in a way that the others were not. But before any of that, before the transformation, before the exile, before Perseus and his mirrored shield, there was a girl. Picture her walking along that ancient coastline. The wind is warm. She is young. In the version of the myth that Ovid preserves for us, drawing, scholars believe, on much older Greek sources now partially lost, she was a figure of exceptional beauty. Her hair, in particular, was something people remarked on, golden or dark, depending on which telling you follow, but always described as remarkable, something that caught the light, something that made people look and then look again. But beauty, in the ancient world, was rarely a simple gift for women. It attracted attention of every kind, and attention from the gods was the most dangerous attention of all. Before we reach that part of the story, it is worth sitting with who Medusa was, because the myths, even in their later versions, carry traces of a woman who had a life, a purpose, a devotion. She became, at some point, and we will explore the details of how, a priestess of Athena, a virgin sworn to the goddess of wisdom and craft and just warfare. This was not a passive role, not merely a ceremonial position. To be a priestess of Athena was to dedicate oneself entirely, to tend the sacred spaces, to maintain the rites, to live in service of something larger than personal comfort or desire. There is something quietly powerful in that image, a young woman who chose devotion, who walked the marble halls of Athena's temple with a sense of purpose, who swept the steps clean at dawn and lit the ritual fires at dusk, and believed, as so many in the ancient world believed, that the gods noticed, that faithfulness was rewarded, that the sacred places were safe. She was wrong about that last part, and the wrongness of it would cost her everything. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, stay with the beauty of the before, because in every myth there is a before, and it matters. It is the thing that gives the tragedy its weight. Without the before, without the life that existed prior to the turning point, there is no loss. There is only a monster who was always a monster, and that is not a story. That is just a description. Medusa had a before. She had a coastline she walked along, perhaps, in the early mornings when the sea was still and the light came low across the water. She had sisters, Stheru and Euryale, and we can imagine them together. 3 sisters in a world that was young, 3 daughters of Phorcys and Keto, the ancient sea deities from whom so many of the sea's creatures descended, born, in some tellings, from the very substance of the ocean. There is something ancient and elemental about that, something that speaks of a world before the Olympian gods had fully consolidated their power, before Zeus sat uncontested on Olympus, and the older forces of the world had been pushed to its edges. The Gorgons were among those older forces. Not monstrous originally, not terrible, just old, and the old things always made the new order nervous. But Medusa was different from her sisters, as we have established, in one crucial way. She was mortal, and that mortality, that singular exposure to the passage of time, may be part of why her story became the one that was told. Immortal beings accumulate no tragedy. They cannot truly lose anything, because they cannot truly end. But a mortal woman, at the intersection of divine power and human vulnerability, that is where the truly terrible stories live. She served Athena faithfully. She was beautiful and devoted and alive in a world where both of those things were dangerous. And then one day, Poseidon noticed her. Let that sentence settle for a moment, because the weight of it is enormous when you know what comes next. The god of the sea, one of the 3 brothers who divided the world among themselves after defeating the Titans, one of the most powerful divine forces in the Greek pantheon, turned his attention to a mortal priestess tending her vows in a goddess's temple. What did it feel like, do you think, to be noticed by a god? Not in the spiritual sense, not in the way we might imagine being noticed by the divine. In the Greek mythological tradition, divine attention was something closer to a weather event. You didn't choose it, you couldn't negotiate with it, you simply experienced it and tried to survive the experience. Medusa did not survive in the way that matters.
But that is the story of the next chapter. For now, close your eyes a little further. Let the image of that ancient coastline rest behind your eyes. The white cliffs, the dark water, the grasses bending sideways in the salt wind. A young woman walking, her hair catching the light, her mind on her devotion. She does not know yet what is coming, and for just a little longer, neither do we. Rest there, in the before, in the world where Medusa was simply Medusa, not a monster, not a cautionary tale, not a face on a shield or a villain in a hero's story, just a woman walking along the edge of the sea, believing that faithfulness was enough to keep her safe. If these cliffs could speak, what stories would they whisper? What did the old sea know, even then, about what was coming? There is a particular quality to sacred spaces. Even now, in this world we have built with glass and steel and the constant low hum of electricity, when you step into a very old place of worship, a cathedral, a mosque, an ancient temple whose roof has long since fallen to the sky, you feel it. Something settles in the air around you. The acoustics change. The quality of the light changes. And something in the animal part of your brain goes quiet, recognizing without language that this is a place where different rules apply. Imagine that feeling and then multiply it by 3,000 years. Athena's temple in the ancient Greek world was not merely a building, it was an idea made physical. A declaration in marble and olive wood and the sacred smoke of ritual fires that the goddess of wisdom was present in this place, that her power resided here, that those who sheltered within these walls were under her protection. Medusa was not merely a visitor to such a temple, she was its keeper, its servant, its devoted inhabitant, bound by vows that would have been considered among the most serious commitments a mortal could make. To be a priestess of Athena, particularly a virgin priestess, was to have removed oneself from the ordinary stream of mortal life. You were not available to the world in the way that other young women were. You belonged, in a very real and formal sense, to the goddess. And you were safe. That was the understanding, the implicit contract. You offered your life and your devotion, and in return, the sacred space was inviolable. No one crossed that threshold with violence or violation in mind. The gods would not permit it. Except, as it turned out, when one of the gods was the one crossing the threshold. Poseidon came to the temple. The ancient sources are not always explicit about what happened next, and that very lack of explicitness is itself part of the story. Ovid, in the Metamorphoses, is the most direct of the classical sources. He states clearly that Poseidon violated Medusa in the temple of Minerva, which is the Roman name for Athena. He uses the word that, even translated across 2,000 years, carries its full, unambiguous weight. There is no euphemism in Ovid that successfully obscures what he is describing. A god assaulted a mortal woman inside a sacred space consecrated to another goddess. That is the crime. Let it be named clearly, because for centuries it was not. The ancient sources often softened it. Neptune loved her, one might read, or Neptune lay with her, as if the participation were mutual, as if a mortal priestess had any meaningful ability to refuse a god who had decided what he wanted. Later retellings softened it further. Some eliminated Poseidon's culpability almost entirely, reducing the event to a background detail, a footnote to the more interesting story of what happened to Medusa afterward. Some versions went so far as to suggest that Medusa was complicit, that she was vain, that she boasted of her beauty and somehow deserved what followed. These reframings are not accidents, they are choices, and choices about who to blame and who to protect in a story are always interesting, because they tell you something about the people making the choice. But in the oldest traces of the myth, in the sources that scholars have pieced together from fragments and references and the echoes that survived inside other stories, the event at the temple is presented as what it was, an assault. A violation of a sacred space, a crime committed by one of the most powerful beings in the mythological universe against one of the most vulnerable. And then it gets worse, because Athena knew. Think about that for a moment as you rest here in the quiet. The goddess of wisdom, the divine being to whom Medusa had given her life in service, the power that was supposed to make the temple inviolable. Athena knew what had happened inside her own sacred house, and the question of what Athena did with that knowledge is the question that sits at the beating heart of this whole story. Poseidon was her uncle, the brother of her father Zeus. In the divine hierarchy of Olympus, he was one of the three supreme powers, equal to Zeus in the division of the cosmos, if not quite equal in the political reality of Olympus's power structure. To directly confront Poseidon, to accuse him, to punish him, to demand justice from him, would have been an act of divine warfare, an upheaval of the cosmic order, a confrontation that even the daughter of Zeus might have hesitated to initiate. Could Athena have punished Poseidon? The honest answer is possibly, at great cost. Could she have done so without consequences rippling through the entire divine order? Almost certainly not. The Olympian pantheon was not a system built on justice. It was a system built on power and alliance and the careful management of relationships between beings who, in their own ways, were as petty and political as any mortal court. And Poseidon had acted on his desire and trusted that the structure around him would absorb it. And it did. The structure absorbed the crime by redirecting the consequence, not upward toward the one who had caused it, but downward toward the one who survived it. Medusa was punished. The manner of her punishment, the serpents, the terrible gaze, the exile, we will explore in the chapters ahead. But before we reach the punishment, stay here for a moment in the temple, in the aftermath of the crime, in the silence that fell over those marble halls. Imagine what it was like for Medusa in those hours. The betrayal would have been layered and enormous. The space she had been told was sacred had not been sacred enough. The goddess she had devoted herself to had not protected her. And the act itself, the assault, the violation, had left her in a world that even then found ways to make the survivor carry the shame of what had been done to them. There is an echo of that pattern that resonates across the centuries, isn't there? The shape of what happened to Medusa in that temple is a shape that repeats throughout human history, in cultures and eras far removed from ancient Greece. The powerful act, the institution closes ranks, the vulnerable person bears the consequence, and the story gets reshaped over time until the one who was harmed becomes the one who is blamed. But in the oldest traces of the myth, in the sources that scholars have pieced together from fragments and references and the echoes that survived inside other stories, the event at the temple is presented as what it was: an assault, a violation of a sacred space, a crime committed by one of the most powerful beings in the mythological universe against one of the most vulnerable. And then it gets worse. Because Athena knew. Think about that for a moment as you rest here in the quiet. The goddess of wisdom, the divine being to whom Medusa had given her life in service, the power that was supposed to make the temple inviolable. Athena knew what had happened inside her own sacred house. And the question of what Athena did with that knowledge is the question that sits at the beating heart of this whole story. Poseidon was her uncle, the brother of her father Zeus. In the divine hierarchy of Olympus, he was one of the three supreme powers, equal to Zeus in the division of the cosmos, if not quite equal in the political reality of Olympus's power structure. To directly confront Poseidon, to accuse him, to punish him, to demand justice from him, would have been an act of divine warfare, an upheaval of the cosmic order, a confrontation that even the daughter of Zeus might have hesitated to initiate. Could Athena have punished Poseidon? The honest answer is possibly, at great cost. Could she have done so without consequences rippling through the entire divine order? Almost certainly not. The Olympian pantheon was not a system built on justice. It was a system built on power and alliance and the careful management of relationships between beings who, in their own ways, were as petty and political as any mortal court. And Poseidon had acted on his desire and trusted that the structure around him would absorb it. And it did. The structure absorbed the crime by redirecting the consequence, not upward toward the one who had caused it, but downward toward the one who survived it. Medusa was punished. The manner of her punishment, the serpents, the terrible gaze, the exile, we will explore in the chapters ahead. But before we reach the punishment, stay here for...
There is a particular kind of injustice that does not announce itself loudly. It does not come with a villain twirling a cape, making clear speeches about its own wrongness. It comes quietly, through institutions, through power structures, through the way that those in authority choose who bears the weight of what has happened and who goes free. It comes through the mechanisms that powerful systems use to protect themselves when something has gone wrong within them. And it comes, most devastatingly, sometimes from the people or institutions that the victim trusted most. Athena was the goddess of wisdom. She was the goddess of just warfare, warfare conducted for righteous reasons under clear principles with proportionate response. She was patron of Athens, the city that prided itself on reason and law and the careful weighing of consequences. She was, in the mythology of ancient Greece, one of the most morally serious of the Olympian gods, and she punished Medusa for being assaulted in her temple. Let us sit with that reality, because the mythological tradition does not always encourage us to sit with it. The classical texts tend to move fairly quickly through Athena's role in what happened to Medusa, partly because dwelling on it raises uncomfortable questions about the justice of the divine order, and partly because by the time most of the surviving versions of this myth were committed to writing, Athena had become one of ancient Greece's most beloved and powerful cultural symbols. Athens was named after her. The Parthenon was built in her honor. Questioning her justice was, in a very real sense, questioning the foundations of Athenian civic identity. So the texts move quickly. Medusa was transformed. There is a brief explanatory note. She was punished for allowing Poseidon into the sacred space, or for her own vanity in comparing herself to the goddess, depending on which version you read. And then the story moves on to Perseus, and the adventure truly begins, and Medusa recedes into the background, as simply the monster that needs to be killed. But let us not move quickly. Let us stay here with Athena and ask the questions. Why did she do it? The various classical sources offer different justifications, and it is worth examining each of them, because the differences tell us something about how the ancient world itself was wrestling with the discomfort of the story. In some versions, Medusa had committed the sin of pride. She had, it is claimed, boasted about her beauty, comparing herself favorably to Athena herself. In one particularly common retelling, she had claimed that her hair was more beautiful than the goddesses, a claim of hubris, of overreach, of the mortal daring to measure herself against the divine. And so the punishment of transforming her hair into serpents was framed as fitting justice, a kind of cosmically poetic revenge. But there are several problems with this version. The first is that it conveniently relocates the cause of Medusa's punishment away from the assault in the temple and places it instead in a vanity that is entirely Medusa's own fault. If she was transformed because of her pride, then Poseidon's role in events becomes irrelevant. The assault either did not happen, or it happened but was essentially Medusa's fault for being beautiful and boastful in a way that attracted divine attention. The crime disappears, and only the punishment remains, now refigured as justice rather than injustice. This is exactly the kind of narrative maneuver that the study of mythology and the study of history more broadly teaches us to pay close attention to. When a story suddenly adds a flaw to a victim, when a new explanation appears that cleanly removes culpability from the powerful party, when the sequence of events is quietly rearranged so that cause and consequence point in a more comfortable direction, that is worth noticing. The second problem is that Ovid's account, written in the 1st century BCE and drawing on Greek sources considerably older, does not mention this pride. Ovid is quite clear about the sequence of events. Poseidon violated Medusa in Minerva's temple. Minerva, Athena, then punished Medusa for what had been done to her in that sacred space. Ovid even notes that Athena shielded her eyes with her aegis, her divine shield, to avoid witnessing the assault, but punished the victim for it nonetheless. That detail about the shield is extraordinary, and we should not pass over it quickly. Athena looked away. She literally shielded her own eyes, and then she punished the person from whom she had averted her gaze. There is something in that gesture, the deliberate looking away followed by the punishment, that resonates far beyond ancient mythology. It is the gesture of an institution that knows something wrong is happening within it, that chooses not to directly confront that wrongness, and then redirects its response in a direction that is safer, more manageable, less politically costly. Now, we should be careful here about projecting modern frameworks entirely onto an ancient tradition that operated within very different moral and metaphysical assumptions. The ancient Greek gods were not intended to be morally perfect. They were powerful, and they were real in the sense that they genuinely shaped the world, but they were not expected to be good in the way that later monotheistic traditions expected divinity to be good. The Olympian gods were petty, competitive, vengeful, lustful, and frequently unjust. That was not considered a flaw in the mythology. It was considered an accurate reflection of the universe's nature. And yet, Athena was supposed to be the exception. Wisdom, justice, measured response, the patroness of rational thought and fair governance. If any of the Olympians could have chosen differently in how they responded to what happened in that temple, it was supposed to be Athena. Her failure, and it is a failure even within the internal logic of the mythology, tells us something important. It tells us that in the ancient world, as in so many worlds since, the systems of power and justice were not built to protect the most vulnerable. They were built to manage relationships between those who held power. Athena and Poseidon were part of the same divine order. They were kin in the Greek sense, born of the same titanic lineage. They shared the same cosmic project, the project of Olympian power, the defeat of the Titans, the organization of the world according to the new divine order. Athena confronting Poseidon directly over a mortal priestess would have created a rupture in that project, and Medusa was the one who bore the cost of Athena's decision not to create that rupture. But here is something else worth considering, something that complicates the simple narrative of Athena as villain or Athena as purely callous. In the ancient Greek mythological tradition, Athena herself was shaped by a world in which female power was always constrained and defined by its relationship to male authority. She was, famously, the goddess born directly from Zeus's head, the divine feminine produced entirely by and from the divine masculine, with no mother in the standard telling. She was a virgin goddess who had rejected and transcended the feminine role that the ancient world assigned to women: reproduction, domesticity, subordination to a husband. Her power was real and significant, but it existed within a system that had placed Poseidon, Zeus, and the other Olympians at the apex of cosmic authority. Her wisdom was genuine, but the structures around her defined the limits of what her wisdom could actually do. This does not excuse the punishment of Medusa, but it contextualizes it. Athena was both a perpetrator of injustice and herself a figure trapped within an unjust structure. She was complicit in the way that those who hold middle power are so often complicit, not by inventing the system, but by operating within it in ways that protect their own position. And Medusa paid the price. There is something almost unbearably human about that dynamic, isn't there? The way that injustice propagates not just from the powerful to the vulnerable, but through the layers in between. The way that those who could intervene often find reasons, real reasons, complicated reasons, not to. As you rest here in the quiet, let your breath come slowly. The injustice of this chapter is real and it is heavy, but let it settle gently. We are not here to be alarmed by the past. We are here to understand it. And understanding is a kind of rest in its own way. To finally see clearly what really happened after centuries of the fog of the official story, that is its own peace. Athena made her choice. She averted her eyes, and then she opened them again and directed their full divine force not at Poseidon, but at Medusa. She transformed the woman who had suffered inside her temple. She made her monstrous in the eyes of the world, and in doing so, she gave the world its monster. A monster that every subsequent generation could point to and fear and hunt and slay, never once asking how it came to be or what it had been before. The punishment was about to be delivered, and as it descended on Medusa, the world was about...
Snakes have always meant something. Long before the Greek mythological tradition, long before the Olympian gods and the heroes and the Greek cycles of myth that the ancient poets would codify, snakes occupied a particular and complex place in the symbolic language of human cultures. They were not simply dangerous animals, though they were that too. They were not merely obstacles to be defeated, though that interpretation would eventually dominate, particularly in the later mythological traditions that overlapped with early Christianity. Before all of that, snakes meant something richer and stranger and more ambiguous. In ancient Egypt, the cobra rose from the crowns of pharaohs, a protector, a living declaration of divine authority and the power to destroy what threatened the sacred order. In ancient Mesopotamia, the serpent was associated with wisdom and with the regeneration of life, a creature that shed its skin and was reborn. In the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete, a culture that preceded classical Greece and deeply influenced it, snake goddesses appeared in religious art, holding serpents in raised hands, figures of power and fertility and the deep rhythms of the natural world. In ancient India, the Nagas were serpent beings of immense power, neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but forces of nature that demanded respect and careful navigation. The point is this: when Athena transformed Medusa's hair into serpents, she was not simply making her hideous in some random way. She was reaching into the very oldest symbolic vocabulary of the ancient Mediterranean world and placing it on Medusa's head. She was doing something with meaning. And the meaning, when you look at it from outside the later tradition that turned Medusa into simply a monster, is considerably more interesting. Snakes on the head of a powerful female figure. In the Minoan tradition, that is a goddess. In the Egyptian tradition, that is a pharaoh. In the older pre-Olympian Greek tradition, the one that the newer mythological system displaced and partially absorbed, female figures with serpentine associations were figures of tremendous authority. They were the earth's voice. They were the wisdom that lived in the ground, in the roots, in the deep places where ordinary mortals did not venture. What Athena did to Medusa may have been, on one level, a punishment. On another level, she may have accidentally, or perhaps not entirely accidentally, done something else. She may have returned Medusa to an older tradition of female power. She may have, in trying to make her monstrous, made her something ancient and enormous instead. The gaze that turned men to stone. Let us think about that for a moment. The gaze in Greek mythology was one of the most potent symbols of power.
The evil eye, the ability to harm through looking, was taken with profound seriousness in the ancient world and continues to be a living belief in many Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures to this day. The person who could project power through their gaze was someone not to be taken lightly. They were someone to be feared, which is different from being someone to be hunted. You do not necessarily hunt things you fear. You also circumnavigate them. You give them wide berth. You acknowledge their power and direct your life around it. The Gorgon's gaze in the older mythological tradition was not simply a weapon of terror. It was a boundary. It said, "Here is a threshold. This is as far as you come. The world beyond this gaze is not available to you." And in the mythology of sacred spaces and forbidden territories, the places where the wild and the divine intersected and mortal men were not meant to go, that kind of boundary had a protective function. The Gorgon image, in fact, was used as a protective symbol in ancient Greece. The face of a Gorgon, the Gorgonion, appeared on doorways, on temples, on shields, specifically to ward off evil. The face was apotropic. It repelled harm. This is fascinating, and it shifts the picture entirely if you sit with it. Medusa's face, her terrible, transformed face, was used by the Greeks not as a symbol of evil, but as a symbol of protection. Her image, placed above a doorway, was believed to keep harmful forces out. Her face, emblazoned on a shield, was believed to protect the warrior who carried it. This was not the way that purely evil symbols were used. Evil things were not placed on doorways to protect homes. Protective power was. So what exactly was Medusa? The mythology is layered in a way that reflects its own complicated history. On the surface layer, the story as most people know it, she is a monster, a Gorgon, a terror to be defeated. On the middle layer, the layer that becomes visible when you look at how her image was actually used in ancient Greek culture, she is something more ambiguous, a figure of power whose gaze kept harmful things at bay. And on the deepest layer, the one that requires going back to pre-Olympian traditions and the mythological echoes of the older world, she may have been something else entirely. A figure of authority, a goddess or goddess adjacent, one of the old powers of the earth, now reframed by a newer mythology as a monster, but carrying within her image the traces of what she had been before. The transformation that Athena inflicted on Medusa may have been, in the long view of mythological history, not so much a punishment as a reclassification. Medusa was reclassified, moved from one category to another, from priestess to monster, from devotee of the goddess to enemy of the gods, from the inner circle of the sacred to the outermost edge of the known world. And yet, the symbolism that was used to make her monstrous was the symbolism of ancient power, the serpents, the terrible gaze, the face that stopped men in their tracks. There is something almost poetic about that failure of transformation. You set out to make someone a monster, and you inadvertently invest them with the iconography of an older, more powerful tradition. You send them to the edge of the world, and in doing so, you connect them to everything that the edge of the world represented in ancient cosmology: the deep, the unknown, the untamed, the forces that predate civilization and will outlast it. You try to remove someone's power, and you end up, in some strange way, giving them more. Of course, Medusa could not use that power. That is the tragedy within the tragedy. The power she had been given, the gaze, the serpents, the terrible presence, was useful only defensively. She could not go out into the world with it. She could not seek justice with it. She was exiled, isolated, placed in a geography that kept her away from the mortal world, and the power she had been given was a power that only activated when someone came to her, when someone crossed the threshold. It kept the world away from her, but it could not bring the world to account. and eventually, inevitably, someone would come across that threshold who had been specifically equipped to do so without falling prey to her gaze. Someone would come who had been given a mirrored shield, a divine sword, the guidance of the gods themselves. Someone would come who was, in the language of the mythology, a hero. But before we reach Perseus, before we look at the machinery of his heroism and ask some uncomfortable questions about it, let us stay for a moment with Medusa in her transformed state. Let us imagine what her life was like after the temple, after Athena, after the serpents. She went to the edge of the world. She went to a place called the Garden of the Hesperides in some versions, or to the far shores of Libya, or to a place simply described as beyond the ocean, at the edge of the night, a liminal zone where the known world ended and the unknown began. She went there with her immortal sisters, Steno and Euralia, who presumably made this journey out of loyalty, or perhaps because the world had become equally strange and dangerous for all of them once one of their number had been marked. Imagine that place, the air somehow different, somehow thinner, or heavier, or simply other. The light at strange angles, as if the sun there followed slightly different rules. Stone figures in the later tellings, men who had come too close, too incautiously, and had been caught in her gaze before they understood what they were dealing with. Standing figures now, silent and permanent. What did Medusa feel surrounded by those figures? Was she lonely? Was she angry? Was there something in her that understood the terrible absurdity of her situation, punished for a crime committed against her, transformed in a way that made her more terrifying, exiled in a way that made her simultaneously powerful and utterly alone? We cannot know. The myth does not give us her interiority. It rarely gives women their interiority. What it gives us is the image, the serpents, the eyes, the sisters at her side, and the slow passing of years in this place where no one came,